Expanding Mind with Eric Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis. And another chapter in the cultures of consciousness. When I got out of college, I spent about 10 years being a pop culture critic and mostly a music critic. So I churned out many a record review. And I still write about music occasionally. I love to write about music. I like to read about it probably less than I used to. In fact, definitely less than I used to. But one of the people I still like to read, I'm very happy to have on the show today, Simon Reynolds, a great critic of my generation. And I think that's actually important to say because one of the things we'll be talking about as we talk about his new book, Retromania, Pop Culture's Addiction to Its Own Past, is how our own sort of age and our own cultural orientation affects the way that we look at popular culture and hear popular culture. Like me, Simon's in his 40s, and I've been friends with him for a long time, and I've appreciated watching him keep the fire that, in my case, started to diminish at some point when the shifts occurred that made writing about popular music a little bit less satisfying for myself. But he's managed to keep it going, and his new book isn't just about music, but about technology and how we relate to the past, and particularly the immediate cultural past. So it's a really wonderful way of actually getting at one of the themes that comes up over and over in this show, which is how technology and media and the internet is subtly and not so subtly changing our very sense of self, our sense of memory, our sense of where we are world. And for me, one of the reasons that music is a really key thing to pay attention to in the question is, for one thing, almost everybody loves music. Not everybody loves art, not everybody loves movies, but pretty much everybody loves music. And at the same time, because there's so much listening and production of music, shifts in the media really impact the way that we experience this art form that, in a lot of ways, can be at least more intimate, more personal, more spiritual, more sort of core to our identities than a lot of the other arts that we may turn to. So when you have a shift as massive as the one that my generation and Simon's generation has gone through, where we grew up and we bought, these 12-inch plastic discs encased in cardboard with big photographs on it, wrapped in plastic, that we couldn't get for free any other way, until we started using, tapes to be able to record them and trade tapes, and even that came on a little later, at least for most of us. And then now we're in a world where you can very readily download almost anything you want for nothing onto some device, and you interface with the menu, and the way you listen to it is different. You're listening to on tiny little speakers or computer speakers. That's an extraordinary media transformation that all changes the way in which we relate to music, and hence the way in which we relate to ourselves. And I was really happy that, in addition to saying lots of smart, beautiful things about particular bands and how music sounds, Simon really reflects on some of these larger issues in Retromania, and so it really ends up applying to the world beyond listening and consuming and music. Before we bring Simon on, I'd like to bring on our co-host here on Expanding Mind, Maja Daou. How you doing, Maja?
Good, Eric. How are you doing?
Good. And you're doing speaking of retro, you're doing an event soon in Los Angeles, Occult LA, where you're showing witchcraft film. What do you do? What's this thing about?
It's called Season of the Witch, and it's the purpose is really to educate people about what witches are, and we're going to do a retrospective, like you said, of seeing how witches are portrayed in popular cinema and kind of how they get out in media and culture. Because, I mean, to me, like with music too, the way that it's portrayed by critics and, you know, by people that infiltrate it into popular culture, that kind of dictates the kind of language that's around certain concepts. I mean, I think that's true with music too. If you look at how many songs have been written about, say, like witches, you can see how they undergo this transformation through different portrayals through culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what that makes me think of, and I think we'll be talking about it some this hour, is how, you know, one of the appeals of the witch as an image, as something to get interested in, or something to quote unquote be, is that it creates a sense of tradition, that there's some connection to some hidden lineage that goes back in the past, and so in our rootless contemporary moment, it's we can participate in this sort of underground lineage that ties us into, you know, pre-modern experience. But at the same time, when I think about The Witch, and I think a lot, you know, looking at a lot of the films you're going to be showing clips from, you know, a lot of it also has to do for us with the counterculture.
Yes.
That our romance of the witch isn't necessarily about medieval witches or ancient witches in Greece or Ireland. It's also very much about like hippie freaks who decided to like push the spiritual envelope into, you know, the supernatural. And a lot of our sense about the occult today is also a kind of closer nostalgia about the 60s and 70s. I mean, and
yeah.
Wouldn't you say that's partly what you're looking at?
Exactly, very much so. And I mean, really, you could say a witch is kind of like punk rock, you know? They present a counterculture movement that's tied to a certain tradition, right? You can say that about, like, I mean, you're right, more so in that it's tied to 60s and 70s, especially in Los Angeles and film culture, because you could maybe say more like psychedelic rock. You could compare witches, kind of bands like that set a counterculture movement and their affiliation through a kind of, you know, tradition and genre that then would kind of set the stage for that kind of expression.
Cool. That's great. Well, with that, we're going to bring on Simon. Simon, thanks so much for being on Expanding Mind.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. Great to be here.
Very good. Good. And as you can tell, Simon is British, but he lives in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'm in lovely South Pasadena, which is actually a separate civic entity from the rest of LA, but it's kind of subsumed within the vast sprawl of LA.
Yeah. So, I kind of wanted to start out a little bit about like the sort of personal side of it, because I got more of it. You've always managed to weave yourself in your own experiences, your own enthusiasms into your writing. But this book, to me, I had more of a sense of you kind of going into your own experience, reflecting on your own life and earlier life with listening to music and being a passionate music fan, but also how that's changed as age and as you, like everyone else, enters in or is forced into this sort of screaming cacophony of internet culture and all of that. So what was it that sort of opened up that in a way a kind of more personal set of questions that seemed to feed this book?
Well, the previous books I did, like the one on post-punk, Rip It Up, and Energy Flash about Generation Ecstasy, as it's known here, are obviously very personal in the sense of, they're born of passion for the music, but I didn't use the word I that much, There would be certain, in the techno book, there would be certain bits where I talk about particular experiences in clubs, but it wasn't, I tended to sort of, while it was all born of passion and enthusiasm for the music, I tended to let the protagonists of the stories were much more the bands in the case of the Rip It Up book, or just the music itself. And this one, I have brought my own experience right up front much more frequently, and it is partly to do with trying to sort of work out what has actually changed, doing kind of memory exercises in a sense of sort of. Because a lot of retro culture and the way we interface with music, the way we use music and share it, and all these things we do with music, the digital culture has grown up gradually around us. Sometimes you have to do these kind of memory exercises to sort of try and remember actually what it was like to live in a a cultural economy of scarcity, and so there's a bit of that going on. But it's just, quite a lot of the book is to do with nostalgia and the sort of my own conflicted feelings about it. Being quite a nostalgic person, yet also kind of always in music, trying to look for the new thing, trying to see what the sort of coming wave of music is. And I guess the other aspect is just through, there's a lot about how, what it's like to be a music fan in the internet age. And that's just from observing my own sort of uses of music and finding out that there's lots of unsatisfying aspects. It's so easy to skip from one track to another track, or sort of, you download more things than you can ever listen to, and you can't stop yourself. There's a sort of confessional aspect, the confessions of a digital music addict who's realizing that this isn't the best way to live, really. It's certainly not the best way to really form strong attachments to music and really get lost in it.
Yeah. Wonderful questions, and think there's so many different directions to go. And I just want to say again, one of the things I appreciate your book, and I hope it gets read outside of sort of strictly music fan kind of circles, because in the discussion around technology and how it's changing culture and how it's changing consciousness and the sense of self, it's so often, even today, that it gets polarized into this Luddite versus enthusiast camp. And if you start to raise criticisms, questions about how good is this, how satisfying is it, then almost invariably you get sucked into this kind of Luddite position. And at the same time, you have people who are just trumpeting the new and the novelty and keep reinscribing this moment of like revolutionary optimism, where like just the next thing is going to, news now, social media is going to create whole new ways of enjoying and sharing music, And you've done a wonderful job, because you are so committed to the new, and because while you are a nostalgic person and write very movingly about your own feelings through music, you're also, wry and skeptical enough not to fall into sort of easy romanticism about the past and the analog and the organic days of the early 1970s or whatever. So what you've also created is a book that really wrestles with both these moments. And frankly, from my perspective, it takes a little courage at this point, when you're, still very much devoted to writing about music as it is now, to ask these deeper questions. It's like, wow, maybe this in some ways really is not as satisfying, even though it looks like it's a lot more, on the surface, it's a big smorgasbord. So while we could talk about many things, let's go with that. Let's go with the difference between the glut now and what you just mentioned, the culture of scarcity that was around music, 30 years ago, 30 years ago. What do you mean by the culture of scarcity?
Well, I think, it was almost like a mental effort to reconstruct a sense of what it was like. I had to really think, how things had changed. But I mean, when I was growing up with music, and I don't want to say that there were downsides to how things were. I wrote an essay that sort of parallel to the book in the Wire magazine, and I talk about the analog system and this bumpy transition to the digital system. And in the analog system, music and discourse about music, i.e. writing, was obviously in solid form. It was like something that had to be physically transported, to places. So, I would read the music papers religiously, and you had to wait for that day. There was this sacred day, not sacred, but, the exciting day when they would arrive in my town. They arrived a little bit earlier in London, in the centre of London. In my town, it was the next day, and in Scotland, I think, because it's 400 miles away, they arrived the day after. And you would rush down there and you'd read them, and then you'd keep these solid objects, these music papers, in your house, and you'd go back and reread them, and, there are pieces of prose I can almost remember in the way that people used to, in the 19th century, could remember great swathes of Tennyson or epic poetry or whatever. So it made a deep impression on you. So that's the writing about music. And then the music itself, you had to wait for things to come out. There was a finite number of records you could really own. I mean, you might tape records off friends, but again, you had to, you couldn't buy an infinite number of blank cassettes when you were young. And if you not immensely wealthy, you have limited resources. So I think what happened was you had a relatively limited amount of music coming into your life, and you just listened to it a lot deeper. When I bought a record, it was a kind of momentous decision because that was all my allowance, all my, I worked at an egg stall to raise extra money to buy records, and that was really poorly paid, unpleasant work. But, so buying a record was a big deal, and if you didn't initially like it, you would stick with it because you desperately wanted to extract your value out of it or find something in it. And sometimes you did. Sometimes a record would grow on you after the night's play. So I think the thing is, if you have, in a weird sort of way, when you're a music fan, then what the current situation would seem like paradise, wouldn't it? Like you can get everything you want from all across music history and the current music. You as most people do, a lot of people anyway, get it for nothing. So they do it the naughty way. But you could even check things out through if you just want to check things out, you can check them out as YouTube clips, as any number of ways. There's so much free music given away, DJ mixes. It's just an absolute superabundance of music. And I guess probably 1979 me, or even 1991 me, would have thought, wow, this is bounty beyond belief, and what a paradise. But of course, when you get there, the downsides become apparent, which is that it's actually too much music to process, to have feelings about. You can't feel it. It's
really interesting. It's kind of like dating. Right? You can be in love with one person and maybe see some other people, but what if you could just date everyone and just have sex with everyone? It would just be too much. I love that idea that experiencing the music is part of it, and that idea of nostalgia. When I think about music, for me, the ones that hit me the most were related to events and people at the time I was experiencing it. It became a part of an entire experience, going to a concert or going to a show of the band after you bought the record with your best friend at the record store because you guys have been hanging out in 7-Eleven and heard it or whatever. That all accumulates into a feeling that is expressed through the music. So when that's just kind of removed and digitized, there's no connection to it through the little strings of your heart that can relate to your life. So it's like dumping the dictionary into your brain. There's no context. It's kind of place a receptacle to place it into. It becomes a little ridiculous.
Yeah, I think I'm sure there are people who do fall in love with groups or records today and have that intense sort of bond with them, and it does be the soundtrack to their lives. But I think certainly for music obsessives like me, it's definitely there's a huge downside to all this availability of music. You just, because you're greedy, you've grown up in the scarcity economy, so, it's really the whole internet boom of free music, which I know it shouldn't be free really, but effectively it is. It's like you get to it's like the key to the candy shop. If you had this experience of growing up through the scarcity economy of music, and then but of course, the kid in the candy shop would get obese, nauseous, their teeth would rot, there's something, there's a definite downside to this sort of what seems like affluence, what seems like, a cornucopia of music. It just sort of, it's too much, I think, that's the thing.
I think, and then another aspect of this, and this opens up, one of the major themes in your book, is that analog system didn't just create a culture of scarcity, but also a culture of kind of distance, and where there was more space and less immediacy in the ways that music could develop. And one of the ways that I think about this is that the analog system allowed for a more or less organic, and that's always a tricky word, but organic development of subcultures, because even if a lot of music was being made by commercial, big corporate players, not all of it was, especially once you get to the mid to late 70s and the 1980s. But even in the sort of classic, heyday, there was sort of space for people to really build cultural frameworks around things that had a lot of density and weight and even inertia. So you could have like a Deadhead scene, or you could have, there's all these different kinds of subcultural identities that grow up around music. And it's not like those things don't happen exactly today, but as you point out in your book, most of it is either directly recycled or sort of cut and paste, where almost as if there's this sort of archive of not just musical genres and musical forms and actual records, but there's an archive of kind of cultural identities, of style, of ways in which people, especially young people, used to kind of explore and perform identity. But now there's so much, that archive is everywhere, that the whole way in which I defined myself through my musical explorations, even listening to music that wasn't my official identity. I looked like a stoner hippie, but I listened to punk rock. I didn't identify with punk rock, but it influenced my identity. I think that a lot of that has also changed, and that's to be another aspect of what you're talking about, is the kind of cultural values that go along with music are also really compressed in this new era.
Yeah, everything's sped up. I mean, an analogy, a way of sort of looking at it over a long historical scheme would be, in Britain, there used to be music papers that came out every week. There were 4 of them. And so that made the whole music scene a lot more accelerated than the American music scene, because I think it was only ever monthly. So I think maybe Rolling Stone was, at one point, tried to come out every 2 weeks, but it gave up on that idea. So, characteristically, there was always scenes developed much more slowly in America and perhaps had deeper roots. Britain had a bit of a sort of hype, much more of a hype, fast turnover thing, which I, enjoyed growing up. But I think, now that we have blogs and webzines that are changing their content every day or faster even, it's just, things have gone even beyond what it was like in Britain during the days of the weekly music press. There's just this frantic turnover, and there's more people than ever, bloggers, sort of people in that semi-professional zone of writing about music, and then sort of people even on newspapers who are very sharp and following trends very closely these days. Just everyone is covering everything like the instant it happens. So there isn't, as you said, this thing that you talk about, the delay, the breathing space, the fermentation time for subcultures and sounds to develop has really shriveled. I mean, if you think of something like grunge, it took really about 7 or 8 years for it to sort of ferment in the Pacific Northwest. And there was almost like a bottlenecking thing going on, is that the right word? Where there's this build-up of all this alternative music, and finally it breaks through. The major labels actually tried to sign a lot of those bands, but they were held back by radio and MTV, and then finally it all burst through. But, now that there isn't really that kind of slow build-up of an underground or a subculture, it doesn't seem to happen. Like things, really tiny trends in the blogosphere will get written about by the Guardian newspaper in England, weeks after they're talked about. So it's all too frenetic, I think. But one of the things I talk about...
So how does that...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
One of the things I talk about is this phrase. I talk about how there's this weird combination of speed and standstill. So you have, this sort of rapid rotation of micro trends, but also just a lot of things that just stick around, and a lot of recycling and a lot of, YouTube is full of old clips of TV commercials from the 70s that someone's collated and put up there for our enjoyment. And they are enjoyable, but, it's weird at how much old matter. You think of new media, but a lot of the stuff that circulates within new media is really old, nostalgic crud, isn't it?
The majority of movies... I was just going to say the majority of movies are all remakes, too.
Yeah. I was going to write more about that I sort of know that happened. I was going to write more about that in the book, but then I just thought, well, it didn't seem like as mysterious a phenomenon. It seemed like they're fairly business-driven. I think, studio executives they kind of just think, well, this is a good way to get people into movie theaters, and you get the younger people, but you also get the older audience who remember the Smurfs, which is is the Smurfs early 90s nostalgia? I can't remember when the Smurfs was, but
that was like 80s, late 70s, 80s.
I remember in the movie Slacker, there's a scene where these guys are talking about some kind of weird cosmology they developed out of the Smurfs, which was funny. That was a 91 movie, I think, but. It's strange, isn't it? How fast everything.
Well, again, what I like is how you, by looking at the music, that you really talk about something deeper, like this or broader, I should say, that this feeling of standstill and constant change really gets at something that I think a lot of people, if they reflect, especially over the last 10 years, where even the whole dynamic of history seems weirdly suspended, even as it's intensifying. It's like we're so used to reading about technological breakthroughs or scientific breakthroughs, and if you look at the headlines on the New York Times, which is already a retro thing to do, half of them you're like, oh, this is from a science fiction movie that now I'm in, but there's no sense of kind of propulsion other than an ambient dread that the whole thing is going to kind of collapse. And it's really hard to see how genuinely new things can develop in there. And one of the arguments you make in the book that really stuck with me, because I kept trying to think of counterexamples, is just how many genuinely new or even relatively new genres have developed either in dance music, which is particularly good at developing new genres, at least over the last couple of decades, or other forms of popular music. What kind of really new genres have come up over the last decade? And your answer was pretty few, right?
Yeah, I mean they're really small ones that are pretty freaky, on far from anywhere near the mainstream or even the sort of the center of alternative music. Just strange little beats subcultures in among black teenagers in Chicago. Although when you actually listen to them, they do sound pretty weird. But when you listen to them, a lot of the actual basic sounds come from 80s electro and drum machine sounds and little tricks they do with vocals on sampling keyboards. I'm talking about this style of music called footwork, which is pretty cool and weird, but it's not like a whole new dimension of sound, I don't think. I mean, the thing that struck me really was, particularly the fact that hip-hop and R&B that had been so exciting in the 90s seems to kind of pretty much stuck in a rut sonically. It still comes up with good stuff fairly regularly, but there's not been any kind of new beat paradigm. There's not, since, what Timbaland and the Neptunes and people like that did round about the cusp of the millennium shifting. It doesn't seem to have been like some super mind-blowing thing that's come out of rap and R&B. And often, I tend to thought that black music has historically largely been the engine of new rhythms, new ways of vocalizing, new sort of emotional forms of expression.
Well, but they also have this big aspect of retrospect, too, because most of those are based on beats that are from the roots of those people, where they'll play loops from old stuff and make something new, right? So it is this, like, new wave in a lot of those kind of musics, but they're always based and rooted in some kind of past. I mean, you look at, like, Tribe Called Quest, which was one of the big kind of huge breakthroughs. That was all based on, like, soul beats and stuff like that. So there is this kind of recycling that even happens in that genre.
Yeah, I think I always felt like black music had a kind of more healthy relationship to its own past, in the sense that, you get it in reggae, like in dancehall, they sometimes reuse sort of old roots reggae rhythms, so they kind of make them more modern and sort of mechanical, I guess, mechanistic in some way. But it's sort of, in black music generally, they tend to sort of reuse stuff, but in a sort of totally matter-of-fact way. There's not really any irony or playfulness, but nor is there any kind of real suffocating reverence. So those seem to be the two poles you get with a lot of white music, particularly white alternative music. It's either very sort of camp and pastiche and sort of hollowed out, or it's sort of rather suffocatingly pious about the lost golden age.
Well, I want to talk some more about this particular issue about these different relationships to the past and this weird dialectic of, or it's not even a dialectic because I don't know if it's going anywhere, but irony and undue reverence. But we got to take a break right now. This is Erik Davis on Expanding Mind. We're talking with Simon Reynolds on the Progressive Radio Network, and we'll be back in just a few.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Maja Daou. We're here with Erik Davis and Simon Reynolds, and we're talking about his new book, Retromania, Pop Culture's Addiction to Its Own Past. And we were talking before the break about kind of connections to past and roots in music, and I, as a person, am kind of obsessed with sources and tracing things to their origins. And with music, I always pay attention to those kind of things. Like if I like a Led Zeppelin song, I want to know who's the blues guy that sang that song and listen to that, and then where'd he get it from, and people's influences. I'm always into kind of like researching those. And to me, sometimes I kind of see music as a biological organism with these sort of atavisms or throwbacks in their evolutionary history that they can draw from. And sometimes it can be as simple as an individual might have listened to their grandparents' music and then incorporate that into their influences, where it can become kind of literally ancestral. And I was just wondering, what do you think the difference is between something like we were talking about how like a lot of black musicians can pay homage to ancestral sources, like if it's reggae, or certainly the dub folks, which I'm a big dub fan with like King Tubby and how he'll integrate that, or hip-hop. What's the difference between that and just that kind of empty, hollow, retro kind of homages that we kind of see happening today in some of the more whitey music that's going on?
I think that's a good question. I don't think it's even homage. I think when black musicians in these particular cultures, particularly in Jamaican music, it's much more just what they do, and it's because it's a living culture. I think it's because it's much closer to a folk form in some weird way. Even though it's like using, might use quite a bit of technology, samplers or turntables or whatever. These styles of music are much more like folk forms, and so there's this sort of weird back and forth between the future and the past. There's this great. I was a big fan of the hardcore rave music of the 90s that turned into jungle, and there's this great song by a group called the Future Assassins, and it's a rave song that samples quite a bit of, it has some sort of roots reggae bass lines in it and various other samples in it, but the title of the song, the group are called Future Assassins, the title of the song is Roots and Future, and I thought that phrase has always stuck with me as this sort of somehow capturing the essence of a lot of these, particularly black music cultures, but a lot of dance cultures as well. You can see it going in house music. I think there's a sort of sense of the music's always going forward, but it's never forgetting where it came from. But there's no kind of there's no real camp element to it. There's no irony or pastiche or postmodernism. It's just a sort of back and it's like a cycle. And I think you get that a lot. I hate to use the word healthy, but in healthy music cultures, I think that's a way they work. With the difference between a retro, I think retro is much more like shopping. I think it's much more like you have all this stuff slayed out before you in the sort of the music megastore that is now the internet, but you sort of piece together an identity of yourself. Like I see a lot of young bands. They almost one thing that's changed, I think, is the very way that influence works. Like the word influence used to be something that you didn't really have any control over what influenced you. The influences on you, your formative influences, were pretty much what you just happened to be exposed to, or what you grew up with, which again is a sort of folk culture idea. But now bands actually have portfolios of influences. They actively go out and seek things to be influenced by, and they're competing to find more obscure things. And to be honest,
so they're like posers.
Well, a little bit. To be honest, I actually enjoy a lot of music that's made in that way. Because the people who make it are very clever and they're really good to interview if you're a music journalist. It actually helps. I've interviewed a lot of recent generation bands, and they're super smart, and they've actually often read a lot of books about music, and sometimes I even feel like I'm not really necessary here. What's my role? These guys know what they're doing. They've got a really good rationale. They can discourse about it. But it's a different way of making culture, I think. It's not a folk culture, it's something else, and it does have this aspect of consumerism becoming a form, creativity that's expressed through consumerism.
I think one of the ways that it connects with, it reminds me a little bit more of like art, of contemporary artists, but particularly artists who are trying to make it in the art scene. In that, even though the economies are totally different in those examples, a lot of artists, like at a very early age, they have a kind of sort of almost armor of discourse around what they're doing, and there's this sense of a kind of conceptual operation that it's the heart of what they're doing, even if what they're doing is not particularly conceptual. It's like there's a strong sense of art history, of the previous moves that have been made, and that part of creativity, there's even a question about what is this idea of there being an original genius, etc. Now, in music, there are, we can talk about whatever original geniuses like James Brown or whatever, but in most of the contexts are more like the folk culture you're talking about. But I think what you find now, it's not so much that they're posers. There's just a kind of like portfolio is the perfect word, like a sort of instrumental, clever, well thought out, sort of designed selection of influences or type. I mean, you talk positively about Vampire Weekend in your book, and I even went back and re-listened to those songs again and decided once again that I hated them, partly for that reason. But I understand why you like them, because they are extremely clever and they're very well put together. But for me, they have this sort of hollow echo chamber thing that freaks me out. But that's sort of that kind of designy aspect. But I want to take a little further and also press you a little bit on a point you just made, which is that is part of the disappointment with that music for you that it's not as clear what the role of music discourse is now. What does it mean to be a large a passionate critic and writer about music now versus what it meant for you in the early 90s when you actually helped, I wouldn't say make the scenes that you wrote about happen, but you definitely changed the dynamics, as did a lot of people who were invested particularly in more marginal scenes, just as at a point when the relationship between the margins and the mainstream was fluctuating in all sorts of different ways, that there's a kind of sense of almost a kind of redundancy to even the discourse around music, because nowadays people can go, it's like you can go to a blog where they're writing about it, but you can just as easily go to a darknet blog where they're just providing the link, and you're like, why even talk about it? Like there's sort of a sort of leapfrog through the language that used to be so important to, at least for people who were readers and real passionate people about the language around music was also a big deal.
Yeah, I think there is that sort of feeling of what is the role. I think maybe in the past, certainly with electronic music, not to say that the people in the rave scene weren't smart or clever. In a lot of ways they were aesthetes, but it was it wasn't such a sort of intellectualized discourse. So there was a sort of mediation role for someone like me where I could, translate it into other contexts and sort of see, present it in ways that the people making it necessarily wouldn't make. But now, if I talk to, there are these super bright musicians like Daniel Lopatin, who's the guy behind One O Tricks Point Never, who went, I forget what he studied at college, but he's been through the whole theory trip. He's very fluent in philosophy and all these things, and so he knows what he's doing. I still think with the best of these people like him, I think there's still something expressive coming through, but with a lot of there's something that's drawn from emotions and stuff. But with a lot of musicians, you do kind of want these sort of very conceptualist, super discursively fluent musicians. you do sort of wonder if there's anything really primal or emotional sort of fueling the music. It's a little too well thought out. I can see what you mean about Vampire Weekend, because it is disconcerting that they can, there's a particular interview they did where they just broke down the constituents of every song on their last album, Contra. And it is disconcerting to think that it's done in that sort of, it does feel a little cold-blooded or a little too mapped out, even for me and as a fan of the band.
Yeah, so I want to again press on this, is that, I can hear in my voice, the sort of postmodern voices of people I know who've written about music and written about art and culture today, where they say, this idea of use the word primal or the, emotional or instinct. You didn't say that, but that's another kind of, or intuition or these kind of terms, that those are just sort of fictions, and that we're, that now we see that things work differently, blah, blah, blah. And I'm curious, and I know that you have those voices in your head and you share in some of those ideas and you resist some of those ideas. And that's, again, been a very interesting thing about your criticism since you were writing about, electronic music, which was kind of this symbol of the oncoming digital, networked world, and that some people really triumphed as a kind of radical postmodern break, and that you always sort of maintained a kind of balance of an appreciation for that, but also a conviction about emotions and stuff, and the sort of more traditional way of appreciating music. How would you characterize that for you now? About what is it on a really basic emotional level, either for you or for what you think or what you like about music? What is it that's being lost in this kind of overly conceptual, cut and paste, sort of too information rich environment?
I suppose that what you wonder about is what it actually is the purpose of the music, is in some sort of way. Is it just to be clever? Is it just to mark yourself out as having come up with a clever arrangement of pre-existing sounds that no one else thought of? Is it just a game, or in the past, in a lot of the eras of music that I've grew up on or that I'm fascinated by, like the 60s obviously is a big era I'm always fascinated by. Even when I was, into punk rock, I was at the same time reading about the 60s and reading books like Play Power and about Situationists and things like that. In all these eras of music that I like, there's always been a combination of the music is going somewhere. It might be rooted in the blues, as a lot of 60s music was, but it was going somewhere. And it was, you had individuals who were drawing on their own emotions and life, but the music connected to the world in some either reflecting what was going on or actually intervening in the world in some way. And I suppose it's those dimensions with a lot of the current music that is a bit pastiche-oriented, a bit sort of assembled, the portfolio of cool things it's built out of. You wonder if it's really, is it saying anything about the person who's making it, apart from their taste in music and their interests in past culture, and is it actually in any way commenting on or doing anything to the actual world in the sense of social or political and all these things. There is that sort of sense that it's just music about music, which can be quite enjoyable. Some of my favorite music of the last 10 years has had a bit of that aspect to it, but it does seem like a bit of a dead end if
well, and to me, I mean, that's a really big indicator for me, like the difference between that kind of folk music we were talking about earlier and this kind of manufactured thing. I mean, it can come down to just the soul of the individual that is making it. I mean, are they making it just to, like, have this big masturbation session all over everybody, or are they doing it because they're really onto something and feel something exciting within themselves about it? And to me, you can tell when you listen to it if someone's just, like, noodling off in your ear, or are they really, like, feeling it? And to me, I mean, that's why I like soul. You can have someone sing a song that has been around for hundreds of years, and if that individual sings it could be like nothing else that anyone else has ever sung that song that way before. You can manufacture something entirely new out of all kinds of things. You can pick whatever you want, but if you don't feel it in your heart, then it just kind of becomes that's what I think makes it vapid and this kind of like just to do it to see if you can. It's like a scientist can make a human cow embryo to see if they can, but are they going to do it because they want to save their mother? That's going to be kind of a difference. It's just like becomes the inclusion of soul that kind of, I think, can make that kind of manufactured music be really exceptional.
Yeah, I think that in the end, if the music doesn't, I think people can actually make music in fairly cold-blooded, experimental ways, and it can actually emotionally move you. I think Brian Eno always talked about that. He didn't necessarily have to be drawing on his deep internal feelings, but he could make something that was dreamy or that had an effect on the listener, and his music was very based more on curiosity and playfulness, a kind of playful scientific approach. So it's not like that the sort of more detached way of making music is always going to be lacking that dimension. And there's also a lot of, very expressive, soulful music that isn't really adding anything new to the conversation. Adele is a good example to me. This record that's just been around for half a year and the biggest record of the year, and it's just, it's in some ways it's a great song and a great vocal delivery, but it's just not adding anything to music. I don't think it's a 45-year-old style of music, and it's her big influence is Etta James. It just doesn't seem like in the years that you'd hope for something a bit more 21st century, really.
Well, I think a lot of it is also just what I think of as just the process of data processing, is that more and more of our cultural activities, both productive and consumptive, and just our life maintenance, takes the form of data processing. We're filling out forms, we're tracking files from here to there, we just involved in this kind of busyness of data fluctuation, and that's true whether we're consuming music and downloading it and organizing it, what do we do with it, and do I put it into my phone, and then how am I going to listen to it, and it sounds like crap over these little speakers, and how do I get it into my analog stereo, and all this sort of like these questions and conundrums and little technical problems that we face just in order to consume or enjoy sound. And at the same time, when you're making music, more and more of your time is spent sort of processing data, and whether it's because you're using digital technology, or because you're sampling, or you're like mining your own archive in order to get influences or whatever. And there's just sort of a basic kind of just this spreading morass of like data processing that just in itself it's just only so fun. I mean, it can be kind of compulsively interesting, and from a scientific perspective, you can do fascinating, wonderful things. I mean, some of the more experimental electronic musicians who are kind of working in the boundaries between dance music and more like full-on technical avant-garde art things are doing like really, really brilliant, interesting things with sophisticated, experimental, open-ended, nonlinear forms of technical expression, but most of them don't really work at that level. And I find myself, one of the reasons I have my own relationship to music is becoming more ambivalent and often more disappointing, is that I just hit this wall of like, oh, screw it. Once again, I'm sitting here like processing a bunch of data instead of doing what I used to do. And the thing about that is that even the way music sounds has some of that quality, not just because it's produced digitally, but because we don't hear it in very good ways anymore. That most people growing up now, they're used to listening to, very, thin dynamics, lots of compression on really crappy speakers. And you're like, well, what do they actually listen to? It's like even the listening experience itself is more like listening to data rather than sound. You're like, oh, that's a reference to that, or that beat is like you were listening to kind of like simulated sonic Xeroxes of what sound is actually like. And there's more and more of the Xerox and less of the sound. And it's even in the formal matrix of the music itself. But we've been pissing and moaning. We have 5 minutes left. Where are you seeing stuff that's interesting you, that you feel this heart, or you feel this 21st century music? What are some signs of things that you're really interested in now?
I don't know if I hear any things that really scream out like we're in the 21st century and it's a whole new era for music. But every year I always hear a lot of cool stuff. I mean, I particularly liked, there's a bunch of female musicians doing electronic music, usually solo operators. There's Laurel Halo, who's actually kind of associated with that guy I mentioned, 106 Point Never, Daniel Lopatin. I think they're part of the same scene in Brooklyn. And then there's a woman called Maria Minerva, who is Estonian but based in London. Her label is based in LA, and they're all, it's not as often a lot of the sounds in the music sort of echo, this quite substantial history of electronic music that's built up behind us now, but there's something fresh and different about it, and there's sort of also emotion. There's, quite a few of Maria Minerva songs are about bedrooms, and one's called something like, one's called Bedroom Rock and Roll or something, the other one's called Something Weird's Happening in My Room. So you get this sort of sense of, there's this sort of wistful, lonely, computer shut-in kind of feeling coming from it, which feels kind of quite modern, I think I don't think there's a particularly a dearth of talent. There's lots of talented people, and people are very ingenious and clever. That hasn't gone away. I just feel like somehow this mega archive of music and all the things you were talking about, the digital stuff, about how it's infiltrated every aspect of life and music making and music listening. I think that sort of created a kind of predicament that people are grappling with and trying to get the life, get the emotion back into. So every year I hear plenty of good things to listen to, but I feel like maybe we've been in this phase where we've just been overwhelmed by so much data, this massive archive of 5 decades of pop culture, and it's been a bit too much, really. But people are navigating it. I think there are smart young people, especially the younger people who really have not known the scarcity economy of music, have not known the analog life. They've just only known this way. I think they're kind of vaguely confident that they'll come up with something.
What do you think about, we just have a couple minutes left, but what do you think about people who sort of attempt to create their own artificial conditions of scarcity? I mean, you see that in some like freak folk movements, or the cassette thing where people are just putting stuff out on cassettes and trying to create like little analog pockets. Does that seem like a fruitful line, or one that in some ways is sort of undermined from the get-go?
I see it like a really interesting move. Actually, the Maria Minerva's first record came out on cassette on this label. It's done a lot of cassettes. Not fun. I think same with Laurel Hello. So I think they use all kinds of mixes of technology, analog, digital, and then sometimes the formats they use are vinyl or cassette. I think I find that very alluring myself, the idea of somehow pulling myself back into analog time and playing a record all the way through. One of the problems, I think, with listening to music on a computer or a smartphone is that you have this thing that is also a portal to many other distractions. So it's almost impossible to not read or surf the web while listening to music. And so you're only half your consciousness is on the music. So I find, I think the problem with all these screens really is that they're always pulling you away from a state of focus and immersion in something. Because even looking at a magazine on the web, the magazine itself has got links. It's a bustle of links to different articles, and they want the click-throughs, don't they? They want the total number of clicks. They don't care if you don't actually read the piece. They want the clicks. So magazines are undermining themselves when they're on the web, because they're like encouraging you not to read a whole piece.
Well, Simon, we got to go right now, but thank you so much for articulating our conundrums so well. It's Simon Reynolds, author of Retromania, Pop Culture's Addiction to its Own Path. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me on the show. It was very enjoyable.
Okay, and from me and Nadja, keep your minds open.